Okay, Raimy, how you doing today? How you feeling today?
I'm doing great, Benny. How are you?
Good. The voice is back.
The voice is back. Voice is back.
I had to play with the audio last week to make sure that people could hear you on the back end, and it totally messed up the audio on the podcast. I posted, I think you saw, I posted shorts that had no sound. I posted a full-length version of the podcast that at 30 minutes I disappeared from, and you were talking to nobody.
Why are you blaming me for all of this, though? Like, I didn't realize it was my voice that
It
was the
was.
reason
It was. It was only because I was trying. Well, then otherwise I have to blame myself. So I don't want to do that. But it was really because I was trying to fix the audio to make the audio sound better and to sound less scrappy and scratchy. And it ended up somehow deleting the sound on my end as opposed to on your end. But I think my baritone is perfect. But you, last week at least, left a little bit to be desired. That's all I'll say.
I did. It's all because this bat mitzvah I went to, man. It was just too rowdy. It was too rowdy.
Yeah. So I didn't realize that was the case. I thought you just weren't feeling well, but it was.
No, nothing. I felt great. It just lost my voice.
I understand. Okay. Yeah.
Ways you can tell I'm getting old is this party was it was so loud. It was so loud. Like I was screaming to the person next to me just so we could have like a conversation, and it still just wasn't loud enough.
Then why you lost the voice. I understand. Okay. Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah. Luckily for me, it was an exercise in learning how to use Riverside a little bit better. And Riverside guys, if you're listening to this, because I imagine that on some level you are, they have like that, that scene from Batman when like Alfred walks into the cave and he has all the
screens,
or all the sound and all the audio. Yeah. So I spent hours inside the Riverside trying to go back to the original. Thankfully, the original audio existed in two forms, on the video and separately as an audio file. And so I was able to recreate the podcast and then all the shorts and all the other things. So that was a really, again, we've talked about failures before, from failing to get that right the first time last week to really learning a lot about how some of the inner workings of Riverside for me was actually a good thing. Actually, I heard somebody, I was writing this morning and listening to a podcast, John Maxwell. Do you know who John Maxwell is? John Maxwell is one of the leading teachers on leadership, coaches on leadership. Has tons of books and articles and speeches, whatever. So he wrote a book on failure, and he was interviewed. He said the whole story was interviewed on Good Morning America. And they asked him about the research that he did on the book, and he said it's the one book that he didn't feel he had to do any research on because he lived it. And it was like failure in autobiography. Like it was, from having just failed at so many things. Fail forward was sort of the idea, and you sort of learn. So I picked up a lot of interesting little tidbits of Riverside information last week, which was really good. So I'm having just wasted 4 minutes here. That was my good of the week.
Okay, good. So first of all, it's not a waste. It's not a waste.
Because you talked about before being just smart and just knowing enough to be dangerous, right? So knowing Riverside a little bit better from the standpoint of like how the podcast sets up, how the audio files work, how the video files work, and what you can actually do with them and edit them and splice and move things around is actually not a bad education to have around this, what we're doing. In the event that at some point this works and we actually have people who want to produce this for us and put this out there, it'll be a much smarter conversation around the tech use than it would have been probably before last week, and all the sweat that I went through because I was freaking out that we didn't have the full episode to post. So that worked out in the end. So thank God.
Well, I was going to apologize, but now I guess I don't need to because it all worked out in the end. But I had no idea that my raspy voice led to all of this tumult for you. So yes, thank you for doing all that work on the back end. And I certainly apologize for you going down the rabbit hole of Riverside and figuring it all out.
The truth is, as raspy as it was, there was actually nothing wrong in the end with any of the audio from your side. It was purely on my end that I just couldn't get any of it to work. So again, I don't know what happened. I was recording from a different location last week, but maybe that was part of it. But whatever happened, it glitched, not in the recording, it glitched in the editing from one to the next. It was just, again, that was weird, but okay.
Fair enough.
So that's my good of the week. How about you?
Okay, so my good of the week is a educator, a leader, business owner named Donald Miller. Donald Miller he's an author and runs a company called, the official name of the company, Business Made Simple, I believe, which is also a product that he sells, which is why I'm bumping on it and making sure that that's the actual name of the company, because it's a service. But he's an author. He writes a lot of made simple books, marketing made simple, communications made simple, business made simple. And I've taken a bunch of his courses. I've read a bunch of his books, and this is years ago or back in the day. And he was one of the first people that I looked at fundraising through a business lens from him. I tried to adapt a lot of the principles that he was conveying to the nonprofits of the fundraising world. And I'm still on his email list. I haven't read anything by him in some time, but I'm on his email list, and something came up. It was on mission statements or something like that. And I watched the 4 or 5 minute video that he had on mission statements made simple. And he said something that clicked for me a little bit, something I've been thinking about for quite a long time, but it was the way that he said it. Sometimes it just clicks. And he talked about how when you're a business owner and someone has a problem and you have a product or service that can solve that problem, you should actually position yourself as the guide that's going to help the person that you're selling to solve his or her own problem. You are not the solution in and of itself. You are the guide that's going to help the hero accomplish whatever he or she needs to accomplish. And he relates it back to a lot of movies. He talks about it being, in the story of your company, you are Yoda. You are not Han Solo, or I actually don't know Star Wars, so I'm losing my edge here. I know, it's crazy. We can talk about that another time. But
Oh my goodness.
Harrison Ford. What's Harrison Ford's name? No, Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's Han Solo. Obi-Wan Kenobi. That was what I was looking for. You are not Obi-Wan. You are Yoda. You are Yoda in the story. And I was thinking about it from a fundraising perspective because it was something that, again, I never thought of in this term. And very often I think that fundraising professionals, nonprofit professionals, position the organization as the hero, right? If we like to talk about homeless people are our go-to example. So that there's all these people that are out, without a warm coat, or a bed to sleep in, and this organization exists to be able to put a blanket on them, to be able to give them a bed to sleep in. But when talking to donors, just to position yourself, the organization as the guide, to say you can be the hero for these folks. You can put the blanket on them and be the guide and usher them through that story, was just a way that it was something that I'd danced around, and it was sort of there, but the way that he said it, it just clicked for me. And I thought it was a really nice practical application of his concepts into the fundraising world.
Such an interesting thing, because it brought back, when we interviewed Jeremy Stern. I know we had 2 Jeremys on, so I have to be very specific. So when he talked about fundraising as matchmaking, right? On some level, you're partners and equals in that space. And now you're sort of changing it a little bit, feels like, or you're bringing up a different perspective, that we're talking here about it from the standpoint of the fundraiser is the coach, the master, and the donor, let's say, is the apprentice student. It would help if you knew Star Wars, who's learning how to be the hero, right? For good, right?
Well, I don't know, because even in the matchmaking example, is
there a universe, by the way, that you do know, like you're a Marvel guy or a Star Trek guy or a Superman guy or a Batman guy, that we could use a comical reference that?
So of all of those that you mentioned, the only one that I know well is Batman. And even Batman, I only know Christopher Nolan's Batman. I don't know any of the other Batmans, but I know Christopher Nolan.
Were you a kid?
I was a kid. I'll tell you, I'm so grounded and in this world that I don't have a good imagination. So I wasn't a fantasy or sci-fi guy or superhero.
You're a writer. What do you mean you don't have a?
I'm not a creative fiction writer. I didn't do well in those classes.
Okay.
I don't know.
Back to the story. Yeah, go. I'll share a good one with you just after in a second, but go for it.
Even for the matchmaking analogy, the matchmaker isn't part of the relationship, right? If think about the classic matchmaker sets up a boy and girl. Once the matchmaker makes the introduction, matchmaker's now out of the picture, right? The couple are the ones that take the story, and the story goes from there. So I think even thinking about it the way that Jeremy Stern talked about it, you're a matchmaker matching the funder, the donor, to the cause, and you are sort of on the outside of that story. You're a character in the story. You're Yoda. Yoda has a whole line of baby Yodas now. I know that's a very big thing. Don't really understand that either, but I know that's a thing. And so you're still there. You're still in the story, but the story's not exactly about you.
I like it. I do. It's super interesting. It's amazing you went like Mandalorian there and you don't even know what that is. But I do love a good Yoda story. So I appreciate that. Yoda is one of the great characters of all time. It happens to be. And the way Yoda spoke was backwards and super interesting. So there's a quote that I used to use all the time when I was leading teams, and it's probably not nice, but it would anyway. Someone would say, I'll try. And
I know this one. I know this reference. I live in this world.
You know it for me, or you know it?
I know Yoda.
Okay.
I like it.
So the quote, right, is there, do or do not, there is no try, is such a power killer quote. I just like, anyway, so I get it. I also appreciate we've gone a lot on this, but there are a lot of ways to think about these different kinds of things and these subjects. And so giving different frames and different references to how we think about fundraising, how we think about the role of the donor, how we think about the role of the organization, or the fundraiser in that space. I think there's a lot of ways that people can approach it differently. Whatever really works for them ultimately is the most important. So here's the little side story for just a second. When I was in college, I took a Bible course. Yes, this is true. Took a Bible course. The professor was super interesting guy, very creative, very smart, and like open to all kinds of interpretation. And I wrote a paper in this Bible course on the book of Psalms, about David and his nemesis. In the Bible is Achitophel, right? Anyway, in the book of Samuel. So I wrote it as a parable of Superman against Lex Luthor, right? And I wrote this whole thing. It was a really long, I loved it, honestly, right? And I handed in, I could not believe I handed this as a university level paper, right? And I get it back and I got like a B-. And I was like, it was good. So he said, I actually thought you had the analogy wrong and therefore you didn't get the grade that you wanted. I was like, man. And so I went to him after. I said, what do you mean? So he said, he goes, I really think that's not the right, parallel of superhero versus villain, of Superman versus Lex Luthor. I was like, oh, that's the problem with the Beagles. Yeah, everything else was great. You just had the wrong. I was like, oh, amazing. He goes, yeah, you should go back, rewatch it, and you'll see that I'm right. And it's like, this was a rabbi in the Bible course, right, at Yeshiva University, telling me to go back and watch the comic book movie about, superheroes and villains. And he was right. But I love it. I love that he was willing to accept it, like even as an idea, and didn't just give me an F on the spot and not take it serious. Like he took it legit seriously, graded it seriously, and then just disagreed with the premise. But okay.
It's amazing.
Okay, anyway, subject of the week is metrics and measurables in the nonprofit space. And the question really at the core of this is, what should we measure? Basically, how do we know that we're doing the job right? And that question is subject in its own right to all kinds of interpretation, what that means. But basically at the core is, you have an organization that has a mission or has a vision or has something that it's trying to do in the world, make some change in the world. How do you know? And then how do you share? But how do you know that you're actually doing what it is that you say or that you're out to actually do? That's the question of the day, right? And so the first question I would pose to you here to start this is, why does that matter?
Why do metrics matter? Why does measuring matter?
Because I think if we get into specific metrics too quickly here without putting a little bit of frame on this, I don't think that helps. So I want to just first set the sort of the platform for the conversation as to, why metrics actually matter in this space, maybe differently than they do in other spaces, but why do metrics matter?
So let's start with this, because I think the answer, I don't want to overcomplicate it. I think the answer might be so that we know if we're doing a good job or not. And it can't necessarily tell us what we can do better, but it can tell us if we could be doing better. So I think just at some basic level, we're doing this thing that we hope is going to change results, but let's just put some words to that and say that out loud. Say we're doing X so that we can hope for Y change, and then measure if Y changes happen.
Right. Very Simon Sinek of you to go. That's like his frame for the Y statement. We do X so that Y can be accomplished, whatever that is. I love that. Good job by you. You didn't even know you were quoting a modern day, Yoda, but I don't know that he would appreciate or not appreciate being called Yoda, but maybe he would. I don't know. But yeah, no, again, it's a softball kind of question, but it's an important thing because I think sometimes, and I've seen this, and this is always like a red flag for me, is if you talk to somebody who's a leader and they're not measuring and they're really not paying attention to some form of metric, whether it's the right one or the wrong one is a different question, but they're not, then I don't know that I'm doing anything by helping them fundraise, coach them, consult with them, whatever it is. And so there is something that has to be measured, and it changes probably for every organization and every leader as to what's the key metric and what are they looking at. Yeah. So what you measure matters. Isn't it the John Doerr quote? Right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And the other thing that I'll say is that it could be that it's a harder question to answer in the nonprofit world than in the for-profit world for a variety of reasons. But number one is in the for-profit world that you need to measure because it is the bottom line depends on it, right? That either you can stay in business or you can't. So once you have that big metric identified, are we making more money than we're spending, right? Is there a revenue? Then you can start to break that down and say, okay, what does that mean? And how can we put that under the microscope and really like tear it apart to understand what it means deeply? But just in terms of like, do you have the money to pay your employees? Do you have the money to keep the lights on? Like those are all things that you need to, by definition, answer, or else you cannot do it. It is from a business perspective, life or death. In the nonprofit world, it doesn't really work that way so much because you can raise money and continue to do what you do just to sustain keeping the lights on. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you are moving the needle on what you actually set out to do. So you can sort of hide behind fundraising and just making sure that the light, literally and figuratively, that the lights stay on without ever measuring. So I think you can sort of hide a little bit more in the nonprofit world than you can in the for-profit world when it comes to measuring.
Yeah, there's people that I know who are good fundraisers. I don't know what they do, right? People give them money. You ask them why. He's a good guy.
It's not relationships, because it's about relationships. They have good relationships. They can raise money.
Right. They have good relationships and they're good at the relationships, right? In terms of whether or not they're actually doing anything, as you said, or even if they intend to do anything, sometimes I wonder about, but it's an important piece. I think just, again, at the outset to sort of put a pin in the idea that one, there's a difference between the business space and the nonprofit space, which we've talked about in other conversations in this podcast till this point, which I think are important, that they're just important to show those differences. And there are obviously things that are similar and overlap. And then in this space specifically, the measurements piece of it, there's some specific unique value in how you measure and what you measure in the nonprofit space than how you measure what you measure in the business space. And that's all I really wanted to sort of get at the outset of it. So good. Okay, good. So, so dive in then with me the way I sort of see it in like, when I visualize it, there's sort of like a dashboard in front of me as a leader, and I'm looking at different sets of metrics that I'm measuring as a leader in a nonprofit. So maybe what are some of those like really core categories? Let's build that scaffold here. What are the categories that I'm looking to measure before I get into specific measurements and even ask you about measurements that are undervalued, some that are overvalued, and really then get to like the mix of things that a leader really absolutely has to be measuring. So talk to me about those, the categories of metrics here.
I think there are several, but there's two that sort of rise to the top for me, that I think that these two have equal importance. And those are, one would be your fundraising performance, dollars in, and the other is going to be your program impact. I don't really know a better way to say that, but what are you actually doing that is changing lives, that is making a difference? And I think that those are the two categories that you can sort of start to, those would be the first two things on my dashboard if I were building one. Again, I think there are others. I think there's organizational health, there's community engagement, there's other things that will be on the dashboard. But the top two, for me, everything would come under fundraising performance and program impact.
Okay. And so when inside those two, pick whichever one you want, what are the things that you're then measuring? And we'll start with your list of things that we're measuring in those spaces that are core key for that to actually be of value as an organizational leader?
So the standard things to measure when you are looking at fundraising are going to obviously be dollars in and number donors, number of donors and number of dollars. I think you want to look at the sources for those, how much is coming from how many. That would be just to sort of understand your own donor base, whether that's individuals, whether that's corporations, whether that's grants, all the different sources of fundraising that you're going to be looking at, just to have a basic understanding of where you are raising money. And I would recommend that people do that both in terms of number of donations from each of those things, each of those avenues, and amount of donations coming from each of those things. There are different sort of best practices of what people say that breakdown should look like for healthy organizations. I don't think that's really worth getting into right now because I think it's really case dependent on the sector and the type of organization and the size of the organization. But just having a basic understanding of where money is coming from is really, really important. And then beyond that, and my area has always been focused on individual donors, not so much foundations, grants, government funding, or anything like that. But so looking at, that's where my mind went to, just looking in terms of individual fundraising donations, be looking at what your retention rate looks like, how many donors are coming back for a second year, third year, tells you a lot about the health of your fundraising efforts. You want to be looking at your average gift sizes, the lifetime value of a donor to understand what your future looks like and where you really can build from there. And the last key piece that I would say is to have an understanding of how much money you're spending on your fundraising. Because if it's costing you $9 to raise $10, it's great that you're raising $10, but you're not really raising $10, you're really raising $1. So to understand what's going into all of those efforts, and I think if you have those pieces, those metrics right then and there, then you're going to at least have a view of what your fundraising looks like. And again, at that point, you can start to peel back the layers and dive deeper on each of those things.
Right. I used to, when I was doing the campaigns, I still do it now when I meet up with a new client and I do some form of a world of their money to really get a grasp of, their financial, not just their health, but just where are all the income streams coming into an organization? What are those? What percentage of that funding is from here, there, and everywhere? And how has that maybe changed even just over the short term, the last 2-3 years, let's say, as an organization, just to see when you're doing that mix or that matrix of government funds versus foundations versus individual donors versus events, however, or merchandise, whatever it is that brings in the money, to see how that breaks down. Because then at least you get a not just a dollars picture, you get a health picture also, where potentially some of the risks might be as an organization, just by even just putting it on the screen to look at it and say, oh, wow, 90% of your money comes from government funding, right? If that's true right now today as an organization, 2025 in the United States, you're in a real problem, right? Because we haven't actually talked about it, fully here in the podcast, but with all the freezing and all the issues around federal grants and federal monies, when you are that top heavy in that way, you are at risk, right? So your balance is off kilter. If you're 90% from one foundation, it's the same sort of problem that you might have. And so for me, as a metric, it's less a metric than simply just a mapping of what's going on. But I definitely hear what you're saying in terms of the fundraising health of an organization to get those different things. Like the one that you mentioned that I don't love is the average donation, unless you're inside a specific set of categories. You're looking at average donations in a specific category. What that tells you is also how many donations are coming in a lot of spaces too, I think. So if you have your 1,000 to 5,000 is $1 million, right? Because you don't have a good way of actually measuring that, you don't actually do anything. But if you're able to say, no, we raised $1 million from $1,000 to $5,000 gifts, and that's this number of gifts, and on average, they were skewing towards the 5,000 as opposed to the 1,000, right? So you got a lot of good information, it's not just the data, it's a good metric of actually what's happening inside the quality of your donors. The one that was super interesting that you mentioned at the end there is the cost of doing business effectively in the fundraising, right? And what you're spending. So I'm curious, you go back to what you said. If you're raising $10, it costs you $9. And that's a problem, right? You mentioned that as being a problem.
Maybe. I don't want to say it's a problem. I just want to say it's not as rosy a picture as raising $10. I just want to, I'm not assigning any value to this in terms of good or bad, because it's all relative. Like I don't know enough to know whether that's good or bad. All I can tell you is you're not really raising $10, you're really raising $1 in that scenario.
Yeah, I hear that. One of the things that I think what you mentioned in terms of donor retention, I think is one that always comes up with everybody. And the lifetime value of a donor, which doesn't come up enough, is the idea of, because too often you and I have seen it, the one and dones, person gives me once and then they never see them again. That's not as valuable as the appreciation of the person over the course of 3 to 5 to 7, 10 years. And then how you look at it is, what was the actual cost of that donor over time, right? Is a shrinking cost, right? It's a decreasing cost of that donor, because the first time you got the donor probably cost you an arm and a leg and everything else. But now that the person's held on with you for 10 years and increasing, they've given more each time, they've given multiple times in a year. Over the course of 10 years, they've given you 15 gifts. And the cost of getting that second, third, eighth, ninth, 10th, 12th gift is minimal in comparison. And so if you amortize, to use a good accounting term, if you amortize that donor over the course of the 10 to 15 year life cycle of them as a donor, that's an amazing metric to have. And if you can say to a potential funder, look, our donor base is really loyal. On average, our donors are with us 5 to 7 years. They give more than once a year, each time as an increasing level. The cost of acquisition was X, but over the course of time, the total value the total cost to us as an organization was Y. Like, if you're a real funder, like big time philanthropy, looking to really go somewhere deep with somebody, and that leader can share that information with you about their support system, that's amazing.
It's amazing. And that's the other piece that I like about this exercise and this conversation in general is, once again, to say it again, like, without even saying whether something is good or bad, just having this information is good and gives you a bigger picture, a better picture of your organization. And to say it the other way, not having this information, if you're unable at this stage in your department or your organization, if you say to yourself, like, I just don't have those numbers, I think it's a really important thing to add to your priority list to be able to get them, to be able to redo the way your infrastructure is set up so that you can pull these numbers out and you can say how much money is coming from individual donors, how much money is coming from foundations, corporate gifts, federal grants, whatever it is, to be able to show how much money is coming from each of these avenues, and then to be able to break it down a little bit further. So with any individual donors, this amount is coming from gifts under $1,000. This amount is coming from between $1,000 and $5,000, just to have what your picture looks like. And then you can start to assess whether it's good or bad, whether there's the most room for improvement. But what I can guarantee is that if you don't have that information and then you have that information, you're going to be surprised. Whatever you guess what your organization looks like, you're not going to be right 100% of the time. It's going to be very informative for you. And I think you're going to be able to do a lot with that information. You're going to be able to decide which areas to focus on, and you're going to be able to make a measurable difference in those areas once you decide to focus on them.
Yeah, it's a really good point. When one of the organizations I worked at early on, I did a deep dive on donor retention at the organization. And it wasn't something that I knew about before I'd gone there, because I really hadn't done the formal fundraising as a practice before that. I had raised money, but like, the reporting on it wasn't something that I had spent any time on. And it happened to be, it was a year that our total went down, right? Our total dollars in went down. So I was a little nervous because like I raised less money. And then I said to the person I was doing the work with, I said, okay, we got to look at some of the metrics that are going to make us look better, right? Not fake them or massage them, but legitimately, like, let's take a look at the data to show, what happened. Tell the story through the metrics and the measurements. And it turned out that what happened was that the year before at the gala event, we had honored somebody, brought in a good number of large gifts, right? And so the second year, we didn't have that kind of person. And so the total dollars went down, but our retention rate was up because we lost 5 or 6 big givers, right? But the majority of our donor base stayed with us in a much greater number year to year because of a lot of other things that we had done right. And so showing the organizational leadership that we had increased retention rate, even though we had raised less money, was important because they looked at that was a value for them. It was an important thing. That was a value. It was an alumni-based organization. So that meant, or at least we hypothesized that it meant that more of the alumni had stayed on as donors one year to the next because of some of the activities that we had done over the course of the year to engage and connect and all that other stuff, even though we had lost at the top. That meant we needed to replace some of those donors at the top. Fine. So it helped to inform also, which was key to the metric, to form some of the activity and some of the behaviors and some of the actions we took post once we actually had that. One of the things that someone asked me about recently was burnout. And so I always look at metrics as a way of helping to reduce burnout. It sounds like weird because it's not emotive, but it's purely dollars and data. But I feel like when you have a good picture of what's going on inside your organization from a dollar standpoint, an expense standpoint, an impact standpoint on the metric side of it, so then you're at least clear as to what you are doing and what you're not doing. You're not flailing in the wind when you are not measuring those things and you're not aware of those things and you really don't know where to go next because you're lost. And so this is like a really key. So on the dollar side, what you just talked about is the fundraising component here as a really, really crucial aspect of, if you're a leader in an organization and you're not measuring the fundraising, that whole set of metrics, I'm not sure what you're doing.
Sure. I mean, so I may not know Yoda, but I know Alice in Wonderland. And the quote from there is, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And it's also just that it's...
I thought that was the Yogi Berra, but same thing.
Was it? I don't know. I get them confused. They're just
no,
so similar.
That was. You got that right. I'm just saying it's a yogiism.
Oh, is it?
Similar.
Very well. Fine. But is it really? It's Yogi? It's not Alice?
No, it was Alice. I'm just saying,
fine. Okay,
if you told that quote to me
without... Now I understand.
I might have said Yogi Berra, but okay.
Now I understand. Okay. But in any case, this will tell you exactly where you're going. And then you can know how to get there and have a much better path to getting where you need to go.
Right. If nothing else, and at least it gives you enough fodder for the question as to, okay, this is what it tells me about what was, right? And now help me figure out what I should do next as a result of, because this doesn't if first time I do donor retention as a rate and it comes down at 30%, and I just simply know that the industry standard is Y, and I'm below that, okay, great. I don't know what to do next to fix that, but at least I know where I'm at and I know what I'm shooting for minimally. And so that, does connect the dots a little bit better.
Sure. Just one other real world example is I worked with an organization that was really good at collecting this sort of data, and therefore they were able to set really specific goals for themselves, for the fundraising team. And the year that I worked with them, their very specific goal, I don't remember what the percentage increase they wanted was, but they called it card for card, which means they weren't going to count the number of new donors or how much money came in through new donors or anything like that. The only thing they were really going to measure, the top thing on their dashboard for that year, I want to say they didn't care about the other stuff, but their number one priority for that year was if you had a donor who gave last year, what was your increase this year? So if you gave $100 last year and you gave $110 this year, that's a 10% increase. If it was flat, if it was $100 to $100, then there was no increase. There was no percentage increase. And they put that was their big metric that they put under right on top of their dashboard, a card for card increase. And they had phenomenal results because all the fundraisers that were part of this organization knew that was their driver. If they ever had 6 things to do on their desk that day or that moment, they said, which things should I prioritize? It was, how are we going to move a donor who gave last year and get into increase this year? And everyone was focused on that. And it was only because they had the ability to collect and report on those types of metrics that they were able to be that specific. And it worked. It was phenomenal. Their fundraising went up that year.
I love it. The other thing you mentioned before, besides on the fundraising side, was impact, right?
Yeah.
Mission impact. So how do you work when you're working with an organization, either from the writing standpoint or simply from a strategic standpoint, and you're telling that story So how are they measuring impact? Like, what does that mean? What can that look like as a metric for an organization?
So I'll tell you a little story. You and I don't like to talk to you so much, Bini, about my life pre-Bini, because it's just been all roses since you and I met.
Blah, blah. Move on. Let's go.
I did have another life before I met you. And in that previous life, I worked for the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. I had several different roles in that position. I was with the organization for 11 years, did a bunch of different things for the organization. And for about 3 of those years, maybe more, I was their manager of impact measurement. Is what I did for the organization.
I did not know that. Okay.
I know you did not know that. I know. You're learning so much about me in this episode.
I didn't even know that was a job, but that's like, okay.
It was a job. And
that job would be AI'd away right
now. Maybe. I don't know. I'll have to see what's happening with it right now. It was not my dream job. I did find it fascinating and interesting. I don't think I was particularly great at it. But what made it all the more complicated was that the Jewish Federation, the way that organization is set up, is they do very little. Let's say for the purposes of this conversation, they don't do any direct service. They are a fundraising organization that then disperses the money to other organizations that do the direct service. So they support schools, they support assisted living facilities for the elderly, they support food pantries, but they are not doing any of the direct service. So how are we supposed to measure the impact of all of these different things that are happening in the field? And this is what I spent my day thinking about and doing. And basically, on a very, very first thing that I learned on this job was that you can measure in several different ways, but let's break it down into 2. Let's divide it into 2 ways. There's outputs and outcomes. So the way that I think about this, the way that I thought about it was that outputs are butts in seats, as we say. How many people, these are like things that you can count. How many people are walking through the door? So for instance, let's say you are going to give a speech and you're going to give a speech and you want to fill the auditorium and you're going to talk about coaching for nonprofit professionals. And you rent out an auditorium and you sell out this auditorium. The auditorium can sit 1,000 people, and 1,000 people buy tickets, and 1,000 people put their butts in their seats. So you can mark that off as a success. You have done the thing that you set out to do, in that your goal was to fill the auditorium with 1,000 people, and you filled that auditorium with 1,000 people. That's a great way to do it. That's a lot of the ways that's like the easiest way to do it. That's how many people came to your speech. So again, if you're a food pantry, you can say how many people walked through your doors or how many cans of food that you gave out. I like this. I'm going to change analogies. I'm going to stick to the food pantry analogy for a second because I think it's a little bit easier. However, one of the things that food pantries like to do is they like to give out food. So it's not just about the number of people that they would give out food to, but food pantries, when they needed to report, they started to need to report the sponsoring, let's say, government agencies that were giving them money, or a lot of funders were saying, okay, but how much food are you giving away? So a huge metric, one of the things that they started asking food pantries to give out, one of the main things they started asking food pantries to measure was pounds of food. That is going to give us a good indication of how much food you're giving away. So they started measuring pounds of food that they're giving away through the food pantries. All of a sudden, food pantries were able to measure how many people were walking through the door and the pounds of food that they were giving away. Food pantries started to have like a little bit of a revolt when this happened, though, even though they were doing it and they had to because it was part of their mandate to report. Why? Because how much does a bottle of soda weigh? A bottle of soda weighs however much it weighs. Compare that to, I don't know, a head of lettuce or, some peppers or something like that. They could easily show how impressive their organization was by giving away hundreds of bottles of soda, thousands of bottles of soda. They should just fill these food boxes up with super heavy items that really aren't all that healthy for people and certainly are not filling them up. And like people are going on their merry way. But according to the metrics, they're doing a phenomenal job, right? So that's where outcomes come in. Outcomes, I'm going to switch analogies back to your speech now. Outcomes are going to say, how many people come to hear Bini speak and walk out of that speech feeling inspired and uplifted and able to take something actionable out of it into their lives and go to their their nonprofit and change things. And the way that you sort of capture the outcomes, which are a little bit more elusive, a little bit less easy to wrap your arms around, you can do that in any number of ways. But generally, let's pick an easy way, just for the purposes of this conversation. You can ask people to fill out a survey. You can say, ask people on their way out, or you send them an email afterward, and you say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how impactful did you find the speech that I gave about nonprofit management, or something like that? And then you can get that data back. And that's sort of the second level of program measurement. And the last level, I would say, that I think is probably the hardest to capture is what behavioral change happens from it. So ideally, from your perspective, when you're giving the speech, if you were able to say, okay, we had nonprofit leaders who came into the speech and they had no idea how to measure their impact. And then they came to my speech, they heard my speech, and they left my speech. And then within 3 months after leaving the speech, they all had new dashboards that they could look at, and they could say, okay, we're doing this better, that better, whatever. And all of a sudden we have an actual behavioral change that we can measure to say, my speech caused this. Or at very least, there's a correlation, right, between people that came to my speech and changed their behavior because of it. And that's really like the golden metric. And that's, I think, how nonprofits should really think about program impact. They should start thinking about the outputs, because those are the easiest to collect. Then you start to think about the outcomes, which is was the impact? How did people feel after they left? And then you're going to get to that third level, which is behavioral changes. Are people's lives demonstratively better because of the intervention, because of the service that you provided?
Right. As you were saying that, I was thinking back to a conversation we had a few weeks ago where you talked about giving out coats to the homeless, and outputs versus outcomes versus behavioral impact in that example that you provided at the time, which creates another interesting conversation around that in terms of, yes, we gave out 500 coats, right? And, and that's maybe the output. And what's the outcome of the 500 coats? People were warmer. What's the behavioral change? I'm not sure, but at least you have a metric that is something. But I wonder, so I'm curious in this, and then we have to move on a little bit, but when they're measuring a little bit the wrong thing that way, right? Well, your food pantry example is they're measuring the amount, the poundage of food, right? So what do you do in that space where you feel like the organization is mismeasuring what we're doing? Can you do it?
I think that there's it depends what level of your organization. It depends how influential you are in the organization to make change. It depends what your funders want. If funders want pounds of food, these food pantries were sort of forced to say how much pounds of food they were giving, even though any director of a food pantry will tell you that's a terrible metric to judge them. So to a certain extent,
the theory is that, just pick me inside that metric. Is the theory that the poundage of food indicates what is that?
How much food you're giving out? Because how else are we going to measure? You're also dealing, in this specific case, you were dealing with a service area and a lot of funders that were funding lots of different organizations that were all doing the same thing, but they're all doing it in slightly different ways. So you want to do something in a way that sort of is a catch-all, that every organization can report on this, and then we're going to be able to say, because if I'm a funder that likes to support food pantries and I get applications from 500 different food pantries across the U.S., how am I going to be able to determine who I should fund and who I shouldn't fund? Can't fund all of them, right? So they wanted something that was sort of like to be that, not let's say level the playing field, but to have some ubiquitous metric to say, this is how we know if an organization is doing well. And I think that even those funders that were asking for the metric would tell you it's imperfect. I don't think it takes like a genius to figure out that's not the best metric to put out there, but you need something that's accomplishable. You need something realistic. And to a certain extent, you need to have good faith that people were not stocking the shelves of these food pantries with bottles of soda. Like you need to believe that. You need to believe that, because if we don't have any level of trust that people are actually trying to put good into the world, then I think sort of this whole system breaks down a little bit. So I was a little Forgiving when it came to this stuff if people were collecting the wrong metrics. Because I know we're under-resourced, we're understaffed, this isn't, generally speaking, people's jobs to go and measure this stuff. So when I would turn to organizations, again, I was working for a parent organization that was dealing with other organizations, and those organizations I had to deal with professionals that were out in the field. So I had a lot of sympathy for them. I was very forgiving of them when they had imperfect metrics to give me, and I would collect what I could. But it made it very difficult when I was dealing with organizations that were operating in the same sector, because I lost often at that ubiquitous metric. So for instance, like we gave money to a bunch of different schools, and I was tried very hard to find one metric that I could tie all the schools together with to say, not stack them up, rank them against one another, but to even just give an aggregate number. I'd love to be able to say, like, this is our average SAT score, some sort of standardized metric, but it gets really, really complicated. It gets really complicated.
Is there vanity piece to that metric also? Like the organization, did, 50 tons of food in the last month. It turns out that it was like, I don't know, lead poison. It's something terrible. Like, it was all potatoes, right? And, and so nobody looked under the hood to see what that meant. But as a vanity metric, as a number, it looked good in the PR and the materials that this organization gave out the most food. Forget the fact that they, on the other end of that, the beneficiaries weren't actually benefiting because they were making French fries every day of the week, right?
Well, I think you're bringing up another really excellent point that I gave a lot of thought to, even in that job for manager of impact measurements, because I knew that's not where I was going to end up in my career. And I believe so much in storytelling that where data and storytelling work together, where they conflict, where they live in the same world. And depending on who you're speaking to, some people are really interested in the data, and some people are really interested in the stories, but they have to work together, because you can use data to pretty much say anything you want if you use it for vanity purposes. And so you need those real live stories at the same time, I think, to marry it, but to bring it to life and to say, here's what actually happened when people came to our food pantry or came to hear my speech. But again, especially when it comes to grant reporting and grant applications, the people want what the people want. They want data.
Right. I'm curious, some of what you described here in terms of the different measures, and I'm not sure this is a large piece of the conversation, but it is important. You mentioned different kinds of metrics. You talked about the mission metrics. You talked about the fundraising metrics. As you pull back a little bit further, some of those are what you would call leading, and some of those are lagging, right? And so when we're thinking about organizational health, organizational success, I imagine then, right, and this was my experience, even though I think it was hard for people to appreciate, that you're looking to do a mix of leading and lagging indicators and metrics of success in an organization, right? So dollars raised, let's say, is the lag, right? Because that's the money that's already in. So it shows, oh, we raised more money ultimately than we did last year. And the leading part of that would be the part you mentioned before, is what did we have to do to raise that money? And so how did we become more efficient, let's say, in the process to appreciate that that's going in? So my experience on that, tell me if you have, is that nobody cared so much about the leading indicators in the organizations. They only cared about the lagging indicators, poundage of food, people impacted, dollars raised, and they cared a lot less about the leading side of that, or the cost in on that as well.
I don't know that I would totally agree with that. I think that, look, the bottom line is the bottom line, and lagging indicators are going to be the big headline. But I think smart organizational leaders know that in order to move the bottom line, to increase the bottom line, you need a lot of leading indicators. So food pantries, it might have been super important for the CEO to have their, I don't know, think of an example, their marketing director, like, have X number of partnerships that they speak to, so that, they're going into community centers or assisted living facilities or whatever it is, so that people know about the services that are available to them at the food pantry. That's a leading indicator, right? That's something I can control. I can control how many groups I speak to let people know that these services are available. And that's something that it maybe you're right in that it's a secondary level, right? That's not going to be the first thing on my dashboard. How many groups did we speak to? But it's certainly going to be high up on the dashboard. If we're expecting more people to walk through the doors of our food pantry, then we need to say, what activities are we doing that's going to cause people to walk through the door and not just expect them to magically appear when we've done no PR, no marketing, no nothing. I think the organizations I've worked with largely have understood that you need to measure the leading indicators as well. Even just to marry the two, to the card for card increase organization that just was focused on increases from donors who gave last year. In order to do that, you need to have X number of meetings with current donors, with donors who gave last year. That's a leading indicator. How many times was I able to have a conversation with someone who gave last year? And that's going to be an indication of how much they're going to give next year. Those things have to be measured.
Yeah, no, I hear it. I only raise it just from experience and seeing working with a lot of boards that ultimately, if you could save them all the money in the world, like we looked at the measure, we looked at the cost per impact, we looked at all these other things, or, the cost per donation, and we cut the cost per donation, right? And they'll look at you and they'll say, did you raise more money? Right? Did you help more people? Right? And this was my experience. The first time I tried to start my own consulting company 6 or 7 years ago, it was all on the expense side. And I was looking to help organizations on their operational efficiency. And so I would take over their operations. That was the idea. And they would save a lot of money on the expense side. And that would increase their ROI and a lot of other things because their costs were decreased. And I pitched it to a lot of people, and it didn't go well. Now, it could be my pitching skills. That's certainly possible and very likely. But one friend I sat down with, and I shared this with him, and he said, almost to a quote, he said, if you're not helping them raise more money, they're not going to listen to you. Help them raise more money, then they'll listen to you about the expense side of the business. And I said, really? He said, yeah, because they all answer to boards. And in a lot of cases, the boards simply care about is dollars in because they want to be able to tell the people that they talk to, we raised, $900,000 last year, and this year we raised $1.2 million. And the fact that it cost us $1.1 million to raise that $1.2 million, that's not the story they tell. It's not a question of the health of the organization that they're focused on. They're just interested in the story that they can spin as a result. So that's why I asked that and sort of think about that as part of the conversation. Is where that is. It's, it leads into sort of another part of this conversation is the overrated metric of, what are the things that people measure that they shouldn't be measuring? What are the things that they're not measuring that they should be measuring? But this particular point here for me is like just all they care about ultimately, I think, is, I'm not saying that's the right thing. It's just, it is.
It's certainly not the right thing. And it could be that boards are always in a tricky perspective because you're going to have the atypical board member that's going to roll up his sleeves or her sleeves and really get involved in the everyday nitty gritty of the organization. But for the most part, board members are high level and they're flipping to the back page of whatever booklet you're giving them. That's going to have that bottom line. That's what they're flipping to. Right. So I think it is harder for them to see the forest from the trees because they're so focused on the one thing that they care about. Whereas I think executive directors who live it and breathe it and have a staff and are in it with them, they understand. I don't know. So I think it's a little bit understood that they are responsible to the board. So if the board's not on, can't get behind it, then the executive director's not going to be able to push it up the hill. What we're starting to talk about is detailed and there's minutia, and you have to give me your unfocused attention to understand it because the data requires context. And sometimes board members are not willing to give you their undivided attention. They are giving you an hour of their time, and so cut to the chase and tell me where we stand, and let's move on to the next agenda item.
Yeah, because I was coaching a guy in an organization, and he came in at a point in the organization where the organization was not doing great. And all the board members wanted to do they wanted to hear him that he was raising a lot more money. And we sat together and he laid out all the operational inefficiencies and all the programmatic problems that they had. Right. And I said, that's great. You have a lot of problems. I said, what does the board want from you? So they want me to raise a lot of money. I said, what don't they want from you? It's like, they don't want to hear about our problems. I said, that's right. I said, don't be the problem guy, be the solution guy, right? This has been like a thing for me it's a lived experience of mine in an organization that I was at. I was really good at pointing out all the problems, not great at providing solutions in one particular place, right? But I learned that I didn't want to be the problem guy. I wanted to be the solution guy, right? And so I said to him, I said, stop talking about the problems at the organization. Start talking about the things that you're doing that are solving, right? The solutions that you're implementing, the stories that you're telling, the numbers of meetings that you're going to. Spin a different story for the leadership in the board. But like, it was like a deeper thing that I do with a lot of leaders, which I think is an important piece of this, is you have to, as the leader of the organization, do your best to make metrics and these metrics part of the story of the success of the organization. Otherwise they won't be, and you'll be massively frustrated, and you won't be able to actually show the success that you had when you're in a situation like all they care about is how many dollars did we raise, and they don't care that you saved them 10% on, on the expense and 15% here, and you use a different photographer, which saved, $2,000. And so your gallery, they just want to, we don't care. Right. So part of this, I think is important, is the leader of the organization has to make it their business as part of their role in the organization. Just when they sit with board members and they sit with leaders and they sit with whoever they're sitting with, that this is part of the story of a success of our organization. It might be boring as tears and it might be minutia, but it really, in the nitty gritty, tells the story of actually how we're doing versus how we're actually not doing.
Yeah, it's another thing that I ran up against a lot in my role at the Federation when I was doing this was putting data into context, because you want to be able to give people data. You also want it to be accurate and not to spin it in any sort of way, but you want them to understand what the data says. Part of the hardest job, one of the hardest parts of my job, I remember, was when I would present data and I was using, PowerPoint and putting together a slide deck, is just what the headline of each graph would say. Because the headline of that graph, before they look at the data, the headline of that graph is going to tell the story. And then they're going to see within that story, they're going to find the data. The data will tell, will support it. But you can write a headline. You can write a headline any which way and it can tell a different story. My job was to sort of be impartial. I was agnostic. Wasn't trying to say anything good or bad about anything. I just wanted to present information to people that needed to have that information. And I found it to be really tricky. There's no such thing. There's just no such thing as objective truth when it comes to it, because data needs context. You need to be able to paint that story. And I think the way that you're suggesting it right now is when you're an organizational leader, you're not in my role. You don't have to be agnostic. You can have an opinion, and you can have an opinion and say, okay, here's my opinion based on the data, and here's what I think we should do because of it.
Nothing you can have an opinion. You have to have an opinion.
You have to have an opinion.
In that space. Otherwise, it's being dictated at you rather than you telling or spinning or whatever you want to do. And again, if you have an agenda or you have a goal that you want to get to, then leaving it to someone else to spin the story of the data that you're telling is a disaster.
Very well put. That's very well put.
So you have to sort of step into it that way. And that's why, like I talked about before, pinpointing the problem was great, but providing the solution was better, right? And then showing the metrics that were actually telling you what's going on. Sometimes those metrics are not your fault. They're simply something that you inherit, and you have to now be honest about what's the truth about, your success or failure in the past year. The other thing that I look at too is if you're not tying metrics to stories, two things. If you're tying metrics to stories and the stories aren't true, that's a problem, right? But if you're not tying them to stories at all, and you're just simply metrics in the dark, that's of no value either, because to butcher the line, if you're measuring something and you don't tell anyone about it, you didn't measure anything, right? Because nobody knows that, our retention rate skyrocketed from 40 to 70% and our program impact rate went to 85%, and no one knows why and no one knows how, and we're not telling anybody about it. That's not good. It's just not good leadership, but it's also not good success either.
One of the things that I had was a big learning experience for me when I started that job was a huge piece of advice that I got from someone who was really amazing in the field, like a senior senior person in the country when it came to program evaluation for nonprofits, was he said, begin with the end in mind. Before you start measuring, before you start going out on all of these journeys to figure out to measure, know what you're going to do with the information, know how you're going to think about it. And I struggled with that because that felt very hard to do when I didn't know what it was going to tell me. It's hard to begin in the end of mind when you don't know what you're going to find out. But I don't think that he meant know the exact plans that you're going to have depending on all of the various scenarios that the data is going to tell you. He just meant go have a plan for what you're going to do with the data and how you're going to absorb it and share it with people, and then start to address some of the things that the data tells you, some of the things that you find problematic or alarming. How are you just have a plan for how you're going to start to take that data and put it into actionable plans afterwards. It's hard. It's hard because there's a lot of unknown when it comes to this stuff, but you have to, if you want to improve, you have to measure, you have to share that, you have to understand what the data is telling you and put it in context, and then you have to take action from it.
I'm curious here. Can you share with me a metric that's overrated and a metric that's underrated?
Yes. I'm going to pass it to you. I don't I'm blanking right now. I don't know.
Okay. I'll give you two overrateds first.
Yeah, please.
Total dollars raised is an overrated metric.
Okay,
great. Right. And as to why it's overrated is obvious. It's just a big number, which is great, but it doesn't actually tell you anything. It's misleading. There's no context. It's just like what, right? Like you said before, did it cost us more money to raise more money? Like, I don't even know what that means. And too often we see organizations simply focus on total dollars raised. So the better metric there would be net, right? The net raised year over year. All right. So, but the total dollars raised is an overrated metric. And it's a metric that a lot of people sit on and look at and pat themselves on the back and love, right? Whereas the coaches, consultants, and strategists come in and say, that doesn't tell you any sort of story. That's one.
You're not getting off that easy, right?
Right. A number two example of one that's overrated is number of followers in social media.
Now that you say it, I'm like, oh shit, that's a good one.
No, there's a lot. That one for me is like when I meet with an organization, they tell me, oh, they have 1 million. I remember this clear as day. There's an organization that I worked with on a peer-to-peer campaign in my first 6 months at the company years ago. They had 1 million followers on Facebook. And they were like, we're going to raise a ton of money in this campaign, right? They raised $0 because the metric of total of social media followers, of people who just gave you a thumbs up and like your page, doesn't actually mean anything because their actual engagement rate with those people was near zero, right? And so the better metric is really engagement or some form of an engagement rate that you can monitor in a different way. But like social media followers as a metric is something that everybody uses, that people just throw out there. And people, it's a vanity number. But when you look under the hood, you can see, and I see this a lot also with people like solopreneurs, like you don't need 50,000 followers on LinkedIn. You need 5,000 or whatever the number is. And you really just need to get 100 of those people to buy the thing that you're selling, at a good price. And you have a very strong business. It doesn't need, so those two are overrated in my book. Did I spur any trigger any thinking in your head as to some examples?
No, more as you were talking, I was thinking about why we fall back on them so much. And I think it's because they're generally relatively easy to collect. Certainly in the social media one, the metrics are handed to us. We don't have to do anything. The platforms just give us, and they're public, right? Certainly, again, the social media one, like anyone, I can go on to any organization's Facebook page and see how many followers they have. So it does feel like it's a vanity metric in that regard. In terms of the fundraising one, it's one of those things that it definitely is a vanity metric and it doesn't really tell you much. At the same time, that's one that at least you need to know, right? If you speak to an organization and they don't know that number, then you've found something that's a little bit of a red flag. If I meet a nonprofit leader who doesn't know how many Facebook followers they have, I shake that person's hand and say, teach me to be like you, because that's a good quality. That's a healthy quality, not a healthy quality.
From your work in particular, what's something that is underrated? Like, what do you look at as a metric that tells you that the stuff that you're doing is actually working, but sort of flies under the radar as an underrated metric?
To me, those are going to come out a lot of the outcomes. Those are going, if any organization that's putting out a survey or doing anything more intense than that to really understand that level of behavioral change, I don't think that organizations are really even trying to do that. I don't think they're even trying. I think they've sort of given up because it's hard. But you have a lot of organizations that are doing amazing work out there and don't really have the data to tell that story. They can tell you how many people come to their programs, but they can't tell you exactly what's happening to people after they've attended these programs, after they have that intervention. So anytime I hear about an organization that is doing something that's on that outcomes level and really trying to understand what is happening after people leave from this intervention, from becoming a service recipient, I'm gonna say that is underrated. We've sort of given up on it, I feel like, as a sector a lot because it's hard. And the only times that I see it really are when funders demand it.
Yeah. I like that. It's hard with some of the stuff that we know works, or that I think even people who are leaders know works, but because it doesn't get enough, light from everybody else, they don't want to sit on it or focus on it. And they do get edgy and anxious about the other side of the vanity metric as opposed to the value metric. And I think that's one that you just mentioned. I think that's really important. I'll give you two that I think are underrated in my book. One is time to impact. I think is a value metric for donors, that the faster you can show impact on their dollars, the greater likelihood that they're going to come back. I mean, if you can give them that emotional hit sooner rather than later, I think there's something to that.
What question on that? Are you speaking from a fundraising perspective or from a program perspective now? Are you saying the time to report back to donors how their money was used? Or are you saying how long did it take your $100 that you gave my organization to enter the field and have a measurable impact?
The second one, the reporting is simply an outgrowth of the first of that idea. So I want to be able to tell a donor, you gave $100 and that $100, boom, next day went here and it did this. And that hit avoids a couple of things. One, it avoids that sort of, we've talked about this not in the podcast, but in other places, that sort of dead zone of ambiguity around what my actual dollars actually did for the organization. And I think the time to redonate increases, it speeds up because I've showed massive impact. The reporting on it is the resultant point. Like, I know that I have to report back quickly because I had impact quickly. So to me, that's an underrated metric of an organization's success or impact, is time to value. And I use that in other spaces. So I used to do that with the coaching for campaigns. I flipped some of the work to have immediate impact or immediate value for people that I was working with. I do this with coaching clients now, is that I make sure that in the first time I have a conversation with them, something happens that's really valuable to them right away, that feels like they justified the cost of having jumped into this relationship and started to work together, because they had time to value or time to impact as a metric. I think we could talk about it at a greater length. We don't have all the time in the world to discuss it, but I think, to me, when the organization looks at that and you ask them, here's where this is a tell, what's the time to impact to somebody's donation in your organization? So they gave you $100 today. When does that $100 make a difference in your work? If it's 90 days, 6 months, like, that's a problem, I think, for the donor to feel like, what did I give for? If it's, you call me in 5 months, if it's going to be valuable in 6 months, like, what do we do here if we're trying to do this? It's just sitting in a bank. It's not doing anything. And so I think it's not healthy, one, and I don't think it's good for the donor to sit there and wait until you tell me what the impact is of my donation. That, to me, is a hidden gem and an underrated metric. The other one, which is a much longer conversation, but I think is a really important one. I just want to make sure I have it in front of me. Just want to pull up the right language. Sorry. So I'm going to edit this out. The mission, this one actually we talked about, but without the term mission efficiency ratio. Do you know this one?
No. So organizational health,
ratio, which was, it very much goes to the cost of doing what we're doing, right? But it's an overall cost metric of the outcomes that we've had. So you're putting the expense, the total expense, right, over the actual outcomes, and then you're measuring. And so how much impact did we have per dollar we spent overall? And so I ask, on the accounting side, and business side, you'll always say, what did it cost us to produce that item, right? In the organizational side is, what did it cost us to get the one result, of the work that we're trying to do? So what did it cost us to get that box of food to that person? What did it cost us to get that kid through our school over the course of 12 years? What did it cost to get that medication out to that person so that they could have the vaccine that they needed for whatever, right? So mission efficiency is, we have a mission. How efficient are we at producing the result we want with the work that we're doing? And that, the reason I love it is because it pulls so many pieces of an organization together into that one result item at the bottom of that funnel. Is boom, there's the one person at the bottom of it who is impacted by our work. This is what it cost to get to that result. Can we become more efficient? Are we okay with what we're doing now at the level that we're doing it? To me, that's a massively value added metric, which I think most organizations run away from.
Love it. That's awesome. I never heard of that one before. That's great.
Yeah. So I hadn't heard about it either until recently, when I started thinking about doing metrics and talking about metrics and measurements. But when you start to break it down, first of all, it's a great conversation piece. Most of the time with an organization, they don't know the answer, and that's not a fault, because it's not something that they're expected to know. But when they start to get into that, it's a singular measure that allows them to focus on so many different aspects of the work that they're doing to get to that number. And if and when they get to that number, they will have touched so many aspects of their organization in the process to see, where are the inefficiencies in what we're doing? Is it on the team? Is it in our expense? Is it in our leadership? Is it in our marketing? Whatever it is. But this is the percentage of X that it costs to get to the result. To me, I don't know anybody that uses it, honestly, but I think it's a really great metric for an organization to dive into, to see how they're actually doing.
It's great. I love it. Love it.
Anything else here? So they want to add, as we close this out in this episode, again, we're going to come back to metrics, because we didn't discuss half the different aspects of metrics and measurements that we could talk about, or how you tell the story of the metrics, which you mentioned here. I mean, you dipped the toe into that subject, but I think that's a really important subject, is how you tell the story of the data and the metrics, which we do have to talk about. So, as you're closing this out and you're talking to a leader, you're talking to leadership at organizations, what should they be thinking about? What should they be focusing in on? What should they do, let's say practical right now, from your perspective?
I would say the thing to do, I think, is just, first of all, take stock of what you're currently measuring. Just make a list of those things, and make a list of the things that you think you should be measuring. And you can sort of divide that list into things that are hard to measure and things that are easy to measure. And start to measure the easy stuff. Like, look at the tools that you have available to you, figure out what tools you need if you don't have the right tools in place for it. But just start thinking about measuring, because once you start measuring, you're going to learn a lot about your organization, and you're going to be able to tell the story of your organization in a much better way. It's going to be a hugely beneficial thing to do once you take those steps forward, measuring your impact. But it's hard, but it doesn't have to be. You can take easy steps to get.
Right. A lot of the tools are available to make it easier to measure these things now than in the past. That's one. And two, I would say on that, and maybe this will close out. You don't have to pick the hardest metrics, and you don't get more points for picking the hardest metrics either. Just start measuring. Just pick three. Just pick 3 ones that are on your list that you're not measuring right now, and then, go through the process. You can ChatGPT the process. What do I need to know to be able to measure this, this, and this? Or take it a step back and say, what would say that we're a healthily measured organization? What are the 5 that I really need to be focusing on? And then, pick one in each area. And then you start to, as you said, to become a better organization, a better leader for sure. And obviously the stories that you're going to tell will be better once you do that as well.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. We'll come back to the subject. As always, I should have mentioned at the beginning, I didn't, because I got into my good my good right away. But like and share, subscribe to the podcast, share ideas, subjects, questions, comments, concerns. And if you have someone that you think we should be talking to in the space of the world of good, by all means, we want to have them on the Raimy and Bini podcast. That is it for today. Bye.
Thanks, Benny.